Get comfortable, close your eyes, and prepare yourself for a journey through the most wonderfully pointless, delightfully trivial, and completely unnecessary facts about Red Dead Redemption 2. These are the details that don't matter, the quirks that serve no purpose, the observations that will never help you complete a mission or win a gunfight. But they're fascinating nonetheless. Little windows into the obsessive attention to detail that Rockstar poured into every corner of this massive game. Let these useless facts wash over you like a gentle stream as you drift towards sleep. Let's start with something truly pointless: Arthur Morgan's hair. Not just that it grows, which is actually useful information, but the specific rate at which it grows, and the bizarre interactions this system has with the game world. If you drink a hair tonic, Arthur's hair will grow faster, but here's the useless part. The game tracks hair growth down to the millimetre. There's actual code calculating follicle growth rates based on in-game time passage, and this calculation runs constantly whether you're looking at Arthur or not. The game is simulating hair growth for a character in a video game with the same seriousness that NASA calculates orbital trajectories. But it gets more pointless. If Arthur is wearing a hat, his hair still grows underneath it at the exact same rate. The game doesn't pause hair growth just because you can't see it. Arthur could be wearing a hat for 3 in-game months, and when you finally take it off, his hair will be exactly as long as it should be based on the time that passed. The game is tracking invisible hair growth. This serves absolutely no gameplay purpose because you can't see the hair while the hat is on, but Rockstar programmed it anyway, because apparently they couldn't sleep at night knowing that hair might not be growing under hats. The hair system also interacts with water in completely unnecessary ways. If Arthur goes swimming, his hair gets wet and stays wet for a realistic amount of time based on hair length and ambient temperature. Longer hair takes longer to dry. Wet hair looks different than dry hair, with different light reflection properties and different physics. The game is calculating evaporation rates for virtual hair. You will never need to know this. It will never affect a mission or a challenge. But it's there, running in the background, making sure Arthur's hair dries at the correct rate. Here's another useless detail. Arthur's beard grows in stages, and each stage has a specific name in the game's code. There's stubble, short, medium, long, and various levels beyond that, each with its own 3D model and texture. But the truly pointless part is that the transitions between these stages are gradual, with intermediate models that blend between the defined stages. So there's a beard model for between medium and long that you'll see for maybe a few in-game hours before it transitions to the next stage. Rockstar created dozens of beard models that each appear for such a short time that most players never consciously notice them, just so the transition from one beard length to another would be seamless. The barbershops have their own set of useless details. If you sit in the barber's chair and don't select any services, just sit there doing nothing, the barber will eventually get annoyed and ask you to leave. But before that happens, he'll make small talk, and the small talk changes based on how many times you've visited him before, what time of day it is, and what's happening in the story. The barber has dozens of lines of dialogue for a situation that most players will never experience. Because why would you sit in a barber's chair and not get a haircut? The mirrors in barbershops are actual functioning mirrors with real-time reflections, not pre-rendered images. This means the game is rendering the entire scene twice, once for your normal view and once for the mirror reflection. This is computationally expensive and completely unnecessary, because you're just getting a haircut, but Rockstar did it anyway. And if you look carefully in the mirror, you can see that the reflection is slightly distorted, simulating the imperfect glass that would have been used in mirrors during that time period. The game is simulating 19th century mirror manufacturing defects. Let's talk about something even more useless: the way NPCs react to Arthur's appearance in situations where it doesn't matter at all. If Arthur is covered in mud, NPCs will comment on it even if you're just riding past them, and will never interact with them again. The game is generating contextual dialogue for encounters that last 2 seconds and have no impact on anything. An NPC might say, "You need a bath, friend," as you ride by, and you'll never see that NPC again, but the game made sure they had something to say about your hygiene. But it goes deeper. The game tracks not just whether Arthur is dirty, but what kind of dirty he is. There's mud dirty, which comes from riding through mud or falling in mud. There's blood dirty, which comes from combat or skinning animals. There's dust dirty, which accumulates naturally over time, and NPCs have different reactions to different types of dirt. Someone might be more disturbed by blood than by mud, and their dialogue will reflect this. The game has a dirt taxonomy, and it matters for absolutely nothing except making sure NPCs say the contextually appropriate thing about how dirty you are. Arthur's weight system is famously detailed, but here's a useless aspect of it. The game tracks not just Arthur's overall weight, but the distribution of that weight. An overweight Arthur doesn't just have a bigger belly, he has a bigger face, thicker arms, and even slightly different posture. The game is simulating weight distribution across Arthur's entire body, calculating how fat deposits would realistically accumulate, just so he looks appropriately overweight rather than just scaled up. The weight system also affects Arthur's footprints. A heavier Arthur leaves deeper footprints in snow and mud than a lighter Arthur. The game is calculating the pressure Arthur's weight exerts on different surfaces and adjusting the depth of his footprints accordingly. You will never need to track Arthur by his footprints. This serves no purpose. But if you did need to track Arthur by his footprints, you could theoretically determine his approximate weight from the depth of the impressions he leaves. This is the level of pointless detail we're dealing with. Here's something completely pointless about horses. They have individual personalities that affect their behaviour in ways you'll probably never notice. Some horses are braver than others, which you might notice when predators appear. But some horses also have preferences for certain types of terrain. A horse might slightly prefer running through open fields versus forests, and this preference affects their stamina drain by a fraction of a percent. The difference is so small that you'd need to run controlled experiments to detect it, but it's there, programmed into each horse's individual stats. Horses also have a hidden mood stat that changes based on how you treat them. If you pat your horse frequently, feed it regularly, and don't push it too hard, its mood improves. If you neglect it, crash into things, or let it get injured, its mood worsens. And here's the useless part. This mood stat affects the horse's animations. A happy horse has slightly more energetic animations with more head movement and ear twitching. An unhappy horse has more subdued animations with less movement and a slightly droopier posture. The difference is so subtle that you'd need to watch side-by-side comparisons to notice it, but it's there. The horse bonding system has 4 levels, which everyone knows, but here's what's useless. The game tracks bonding progress with decimal precision. You're not just at bonding level 2, you're at bonding level 2.37 or 2.89. The game is tracking fractional bonding progress that never displays anywhere and doesn't affect anything until you hit the next whole number. It's calculating bonding points to multiple decimal places for no reason except mathematical precision. Horses have different gaits: walk, trot, canter, gallop, and each gait has multiple variations. A horse's trot can be slightly faster or slower, slightly bouncier or smoother, depending on the horse's breed, stats, and current stamina level. The game is simulating realistic horse gaits with multiple variables affecting the animation and speed, creating subtle variations that most players will never consciously notice. You're just holding the button to go faster, but the game is calculating the biomechanics of horse locomotion. Here's a useless fact about horse poop. Horses poop at random intervals based on a timer and their activity level. More active horses poop more frequently. The poop persists in the world for a realistic amount of time before despawning. And here's the truly pointless part. The poop has physics. You can shoot it, and it will react appropriately. You can kick it, and it will roll. The game gave horse poop a physics model. Someone at Rockstar spent time making sure horse poop behaves realistically when interacted with. The poop also attracts flies, which are actual entities in the game world with their own AI. The flies buzz around the poop in realistic patterns, and if you get close enough, you can hear them. The game is simulating fly behavior around horse feces. This is what happens when you give talented developers 8 years and an unlimited budget. They start programming fly AI for poop. Let's talk about something truly useless: the way Arthur's clothes get dirty. It's not just a simple clean or dirty binary. The game tracks dirt accumulation on different parts of each clothing item separately. Your pants might be muddy at the bottom but clean at the top. Your shirt might have blood on the sleeves but be clean on the chest. The game is maintaining a dirt map for each piece of clothing, tracking where dirt accumulates based on what activities you've been doing. Different types of dirt accumulate in different patterns. Mud splashes up from the ground, so it accumulates on the lower parts of clothing. Blood gets on your sleeves when you skin animals or on your chest when you're in close combat. Dust accumulates evenly over time. The game is simulating realistic dirt accumulation patterns based on the source of the dirt and the physics of how it would realistically get on your clothes. Washing your clothes doesn't just make them clean, it makes them wet, and wet clothes look different than dry clothes. They're darker, they reflect light differently, and they gradually dry over time based on the ambient temperature and weather conditions. If you wash your clothes and then immediately go swimming, the game doesn't just reset them to wet. It tracks that they were already wet from washing and adjusts accordingly. The game has a moisture tracking system for clothing. Different fabrics dry at different rates. Cotton dries faster than wool. Leather takes the longest to dry. The game has assigned drying rates to different fabric types and calculates moisture evaporation accordingly. You will never need to know how long it takes for Arthur's leather jacket to dry. This information serves no purpose, but the game tracks it anyway. Here's something pointless about guns. Each gun has a unique serial number, not just a model number or a type designation, but an actual individual serial number that's different for every gun of the same model. If you buy 2 of the same gun, they'll have different serial numbers. These serial numbers are never displayed to the player and serve no gameplay purpose, but they exist in the game's code, uniquely identifying each weapon. Guns also have a hidden history stat that tracks how many bullets have been fired through them. This affects the gun's condition degradation rate. A gun that's been fired thousands of times will degrade slightly faster than a brand new gun, even if they're both currently at the same condition level. The game is simulating barrel wear from repeated firing. This difference is so small that you'd never notice it during normal gameplay, but it's there. The gun customization system lets you change various parts, and each part has a weight that affects the gun's handling. But here's the useless detail. The game calculates the gun's centre of mass based on which parts you've installed, and adjusts the handling characteristics accordingly. A gun with a longer barrel has its centre of mass shifted forward, which affects how quickly you can aim it. The difference is measured in milliseconds and is imperceptible to most players, but the game is doing physics calculations to determine how the weight distribution of your gun modifications affects its handling. Gun engravings are purely cosmetic, which everyone knows. But here's what's useless. Each engraving pattern is actually a 3D model, not just a texture. The engravings have depth and cast shadows. If you look at your gun in the right lighting conditions, you can see that the engravings are actually carved into the metal, with realistic depth and shadow casting. Rockstar modelled decorative engravings in 3 dimensions, even though you'll mostly see them from a distance where the depth is imperceptible. Let's talk about something completely pointless: the way NPCs blink. Every NPC in the game blinks at random intervals that vary based on their emotional state. A calm NPC blinks at a normal rate. A nervous NPC blinks more frequently. An angry NPC might blink less frequently or have longer, more deliberate blinks. The game is simulating realistic blinking patterns based on emotional state, creating a level of detail that operates entirely below the threshold of conscious perception. NPCs also have idle animations that play when they're not doing anything specific, and these animations are context sensitive. An NPC standing in the cold will occasionally shiver and rub their arms. An NPC standing in the heat will occasionally wipe sweat from their forehead. An NPC who's been standing for a long time will shift their weight from foot to foot. The game is giving every NPC contextual idle animations based on environmental conditions and how long they've been in their current state. Here's something useless. NPCs have a comfort stat that decreases over time based on what they're doing. An NPC who's been standing in the same spot for hours will have a low comfort stat, which affects their idle animations and their likelihood of moving to a different location. The game is simulating NPC discomfort and using it to drive behaviour variations. This creates more realistic NPC behaviour, but it's completely unnecessary because you're probably not watching any individual NPC long enough to notice these patterns. NPCs also react to weather changes before they happen. If a storm is approaching, NPCs will start looking at the sky and making comments about the weather before the rain actually starts. The game is giving NPCs the ability to predict weather based on environmental cues like wind speed and cloud cover, just like real people would. This is a completely unnecessary detail that adds realism to NPC behaviour in ways that most players will never notice. Here's a pointless fact about animals. They have daily routines that vary by individual, not just by species. 2 deer in the same area might have slightly different routines, with one preferring to graze in the morning and rest in the afternoon, while the other does the opposite. The game is giving individual animals unique schedules, creating behavioural variation within species that serves no gameplay purpose, but makes the world feel more alive. Animals also remember locations where they've been threatened. If you shoot at a deer and miss, that specific deer will avoid that location for a period of time. The game is tracking individual animal memories of dangerous locations and using those memories to influence behaviour. This means that hunting in the same spot repeatedly will become less effective over time as the local animals learn to avoid it. This is a realistic detail that actually makes hunting more challenging, but it's so subtle that most players probably attribute it to random chance rather than recognizing it as a deliberate system. Predator animals have hunting preferences based on their recent success. A wolf that successfully hunts deer will preferentially target deer in future hunts. A wolf that fails to catch deer but successfully catches rabbits will start targeting rabbits more often. The game is simulating learning and adaptation in predator behaviour, creating animals that adjust their hunting strategies based on experience. Here's something completely useless. Birds have different flight patterns based on their species, size, and current activity. A bird flying to a specific destination flies differently than a bird that's just soaring for pleasure. A bird that's been startled flies differently than a bird that's calmly taking off. The game has multiple flight behaviour patterns for each bird species, and it selects the appropriate pattern based on context. You will never need to identify a bird's emotional state from its flight pattern, but the game makes it possible. Birds also react to weather conditions in realistic ways. Strong winds affect their flight patterns, making them work harder to maintain course. Birds will seek shelter before storms hit, flying to trees or other protected areas. Some bird species are more affected by weather than others, with smaller birds being more dramatically impacted by wind. The game is simulating aerodynamics and bird behaviour with a level of detail that's completely unnecessary for a game about cowboys and outlaws. Let's talk about something truly pointless: the way water behaves. Water in Red Dead Redemption 2 has realistic physics, which is useful. But here's what's useless. The game simulates water temperature based on location, depth, and time of year. Mountain streams are colder than lowland rivers. Deep water is colder than shallow water. Water is colder in winter than in summer. This temperature affects how long Arthur can swim before his health starts to drain from hypothermia, but it also affects things that don't matter at all, like the behaviour of fish and the rate at which wet clothes dry. Water also has different levels of clarity based on location and recent weather. A river that's been swollen by recent rain will be muddier and less clear than the same river during dry weather. The game is tracking water clarity as a dynamic variable that changes based on environmental conditions. This affects visibility when swimming underwater, but it's such a minor detail that most players probably never noticed the variation. The game simulates water currents with realistic physics, which matters for gameplay. But here's what doesn't matter. The currents vary based on the shape of the riverbed, the depth of the water, and obstacles in the water. The game is calculating fluid dynamics for every body of water, creating realistic current patterns that change based on the underwater terrain that you can't even see. Someone at Rockstar programmed realistic river hydraulics for a video game. Here's a useless fact about fire. Campfires burn at different intensities based on the wood used and environmental conditions. A fire built with dry wood burns hotter and brighter than a fire built with damp wood. Wind affects fire behaviour, making flames flicker and dance in realistic patterns. Rain will gradually extinguish fires, with the rate of extinguishment depending on the intensity of the rain and the size of the fire. The game is simulating combustion and fire behaviour, with variables that affect the visual appearance but have no impact on gameplay. Fires also produce smoke that behaves realistically based on wind conditions. Smoke rises straight up in calm conditions but gets blown sideways in windy conditions. The smoke's opacity varies based on the fire's intensity and the type of wood burning. The game is simulating smoke behaviour with realistic physics, creating visual effects that look right but serve no gameplay purpose. Let's talk about something completely unnecessary: the way light behaves. The game uses real-time global illumination, which means light bounces off surfaces realistically. But here's the useless part. The game calculates colour bleeding, where coloured surfaces reflect their colour onto nearby objects. If Arthur stands next to a red wall, his skin will pick up a slight red tint from the reflected light. This is physically accurate but completely imperceptible unless you're specifically looking for it. The game also simulates subsurface scattering for skin, which is how light penetrates the surface of skin and scatters beneath it before emerging. This is what makes skin look like skin rather than like plastic. But the game doesn't just do this for Arthur, it does it for every NPC in the game. Every character has realistic skin rendering with subsurface scattering. Even NPCs you'll see for 5 seconds and never encounter again. Rockstar gave realistic skin to everyone, even though most of them will never be seen in lighting conditions where it matters. Here's something pointless about shadows. They're not just simple projections. The game calculates soft shadows with realistic penumbra, where the shadow gets softer and less defined the farther it is from the object casting it. This is physically accurate. Shadows from nearby objects are sharp, while shadows from distant objects are soft. But this level of shadow realism serves no gameplay purpose. It just makes the shadows look right in ways that most players never consciously notice. The game also simulates atmospheric scattering, which is why distant objects look hazier and more blue-tinted than nearby objects. This is a real atmospheric phenomenon caused by light scattering through air particles. The game calculates this scattering based on distance, humidity, and time of day, creating realistic atmospheric perspective. This makes the world look more realistic, but it's a detail that operates entirely in the realm of subconscious perception. Here's a useless fact about sound. The game simulates realistic sound propagation, including diffraction around obstacles. If someone is talking on the other side of a wall, you'll hear them, but the sound will be muffled and will lose high frequencies. The game is calculating how sound waves interact with obstacles, determining which frequencies can pass through or bend around barriers. This creates realistic audio occlusion, but it's such a subtle effect that most players probably don't consciously notice it. The game also simulates the Doppler effect for moving sound sources. If a train is approaching, its whistle will sound higher pitched than normal. As it passes and moves away, the pitch will drop. The game is calculating the Doppler shift for every moving sound source, creating realistic pitch variations that most players probably attribute to the sound design rather than recognizing as a physics simulation. Sound also reflects off surfaces, creating realistic reverb and echo. The reverb characteristics change based on the environment. A canyon sounds different from a forest, which sounds different from an open plain. The game is calculating acoustic properties for every environment and adjusting sound accordingly. This creates immersive audio, but it's a level of detail that most players experience without consciously recognizing. Here's something completely pointless. Arthur's breath is visible in cold weather, and the visibility of the breath changes based on temperature and humidity. In very cold, dry conditions, the breath is very visible. In moderately cold conditions, it's less visible. The game is calculating the condensation of water vapor in Arthur's breath based on environmental conditions. This is a nice visual detail, but it serves absolutely no purpose beyond looking right. The breath also changes based on Arthur's exertion level. If he's been running, his breath is more visible because he's breathing harder and expelling more water vapour. If he's standing still, his breath is less visible. The game is tracking Arthur's respiration rate and adjusting breath visibility accordingly. This is the kind of detail that makes the world feel real, but that no one consciously notices. Let's talk about something useless about food. Different foods have different eating animations, which everyone notices. But here's what's pointless. The eating animations vary based on Arthur's hunger level. If he's very hungry, he eats faster and more eagerly. If he's not very hungry, he eats more slowly and deliberately. The game is adjusting eating animations based on Arthur's current satiation level, creating behavioural variations that reflect his physical state. Food also has different effects based on when you eat it. Food eaten when Arthur is very hungry provides more benefit than food eaten when he's already full. The game has diminishing returns on food consumption, simulating realistic satiation. This actually matters for gameplay, but here's what doesn't. The game tracks not just overall satiation, but satiation for different food types. If Arthur eats a lot of meat, he'll get less benefit from additional meat, but normal benefit from vegetables. The game has a food variety system that encourages dietary diversity. Different foods also digest at different rates. Meat takes longer to digest than fruit. The game is simulating digestion time and adjusting when the food's benefits wear off accordingly. This creates a more realistic food system, but it's such a subtle effect that most players probably never notice the variation in digestion rates. Here's a pointless fact about Arthur's journal. The handwriting changes based on the circumstances in which he's writing. If he's writing at camp, sitting comfortably, the handwriting is neat and controlled. If he's writing while travelling, the handwriting is messier and less controlled. The game has multiple handwriting styles for journal entries, and it selects the appropriate style based on context. The journal also has different paper textures for different pages, simulating the fact that Arthur is using a physical journal with real paper. Some pages are slightly yellowed or stained, creating visual variety that makes the journal feel like a real object rather than a UI element. This is a completely unnecessary detail that adds to the immersion but serves no functional purpose. Arthur's sketches in the journal vary in quality based on what he's sketching. Animals he's studied extensively are drawn with more detail and accuracy than animals he's only seen briefly. The game is tracking Arthur's familiarity with different subjects and adjusting the sketch quality accordingly. This is a nice touch that rewards exploration, but it's such a subtle detail that many players probably never notice the variation in sketch quality. Let's talk about something truly useless. The way NPCs interact with each other when you're not involved. If you just sit and watch NPCs in a town, you'll see them have conversations, conduct business, and go about their daily routines. But here's what's pointless. These interactions are all unique. NPCs aren't just playing canned animations, they're having actual conversations with context-appropriate dialogue that changes based on their relationship, their current activities, and what's happening in the world. Two NPCs who are friends will have different conversations than two NPCs who are strangers. The game tracks relationships between NPCs and adjusts their interactions accordingly. This creates a more believable world, but it's completely unnecessary because most players are too busy doing missions to sit and watch NPCs interact with each other. NPCs also remember previous interactions with each other. If two NPCs had an argument yesterday, they might still be cold to each other today. If two NPCs had a pleasant conversation, they might greet each other more warmly the next time they meet. The game is tracking the history of NPC interactions and using that history to influence future interactions. This creates continuity in NPC relationships, but it's a level of simulation that operates entirely in the background. Here's something pointless about shops. Shopkeepers remember what you've bought from them and will comment on it. If you buy a lot of ammunition, they might comment on how much shooting you must be doing. If you buy a lot of food, they might comment on your appetite. The game is tracking your purchasing patterns and generating contextual dialogue based on them. Shopkeepers also have different dialogue based on your honor level, how you're dressed, how clean you are, and whether you've caused trouble in their town recently. The game is evaluating multiple variables to determine how the shopkeeper should react to you, creating interactions that feel personalized even though they're generated from a system. Different shopkeepers have different personalities that affect their dialogue and behavior. Some are friendly and chatty, others are gruff and businesslike. Some are nervous around armed customers, others are confident. The game has given each shopkeeper a personality profile that influences their interactions, creating variety in what could have been identical shop experiences. Here's a useless fact about the wanted system. Lawmen don't just spawn when you commit a crime, they're actual NPCs who travel from their stations to investigate. If you commit a crime in a remote area, it will take longer for lawmen to arrive because they have to physically travel to your location. The game is simulating realistic law enforcement response times based on geography. Lawmen also communicate with each other using realistic methods. They'll send telegrams to other towns warning them about criminals, they'll post wanted posters, and they'll share information when they meet. The game is simulating 19th century law enforcement communication networks, creating a system where your crimes in one location can affect your reputation in other locations through realistic information sharing. The wanted system also tracks witnesses separately from lawmen. A witness needs to reach a lawman to report a crime, and if you stop the witness before they reach the lawman, the crime goes unreported. But here's what's useless. Witnesses have different levels of courage. Some witnesses will run directly to the nearest lawman, while others will hide and wait for safety before reporting. The game is giving witnesses personality traits that affect their behavior, creating variation in how crimes get reported. Let's talk about something completely unnecessary: the way clothing affects Arthur's movement. Heavy coats make him move slightly slower and more deliberately. Light clothing allows for more agile movement. The game is adjusting Arthur's movement animations based on what he's wearing, creating subtle variations that most players probably never consciously notice. Clothing also affects how Arthur sits on his horse. With a heavy coat, he sits slightly differently than with a light shirt. The game has different sitting animations for different clothing weights, ensuring that Arthur always looks natural on his horse regardless of what he's wearing. This is a level of animation detail that serves no purpose except making everything look right. Different types of boots make different sounds on different surfaces. Leather boots sound different from work boots, which sound different from fancy dress shoes, and each boot type sounds different on wood versus stone versus dirt. The game has a matrix of boot types and surface types, with unique sounds for each combination. You will never need to identify someone's boot type from the sound they make walking, but the game makes it possible. Here's something pointless about weather. The game doesn't just have different weather types, it has transitions between weather types that are physically realistic. Clear weather doesn't instantly become rainy. First, clouds gather, then the wind picks up, then you might see distant rain before it reaches you. The game is simulating weather system movement across the map, creating realistic weather transitions that unfold over time. The weather also affects NPC behaviour in subtle ways. NPCs walk faster in the rain, trying to get to shelter. They huddle together for warmth in the cold. They seek shade in extreme heat. The game is giving NPCs weather-appropriate behaviours that make them feel more like real people responding to their environment. Weather affects animal behaviour too. Deer seek shelter during storms. Birds fly lower in heavy wind. Fish are more active during certain weather conditions. The game is simulating how weather affects animal behaviour, creating an ecosystem that responds dynamically to environmental conditions. Here's a useless fact about time. The game's day-night cycle is 48 minutes long, which everyone knows. But here's what's pointless. The rate at which time passes varies slightly based on what you're doing. Time passes slightly faster when you're travelling than when you're in town. Time passes slightly slower during missions than during free roam. The game is adjusting time passage rates to optimise pacing, creating a time system that's not actually consistent but feels right. The position of the sun and moon is astronomically accurate for the game's latitude and time period. If you know astronomy, you can navigate by the stars in Red Dead Redemption 2 just like you could in the real world. The game consulted astronomical charts to ensure celestial accuracy, even though 99.9% of players will never try to navigate by the stars. The moon goes through actual lunar phases over the course of in-game months, which affects nighttime lighting. But here's what's useless. The lunar phase also affects animal behaviour. Some animals are more active during full moons, others during new moons. The game is simulating lunar influence on animal behaviour, creating patterns that most players will never notice because they're not tracking animal activity across multiple lunar cycles. Let's talk about something completely pointless: the way objects react to being shot. Every object in the game has physics properties that determine how it reacts to bullets. A glass bottle shatters differently than a wooden crate, which reacts differently than a metal can. But here's what's useless. The reaction varies based on where the object is hit, and what caliber bullet hits it. A small caliber bullet will make a small hole in a wooden crate. A large caliber bullet will make a large hole. The game is calculating bullet impact effects based on projectile properties and material properties. Objects also react differently based on their current state. A full bottle of liquid reacts differently when shot than an empty bottle. The liquid will spray out, and the bottle will shatter in a pattern, influenced by the liquid presence. The game is simulating how the contents of containers affect their destruction physics. This is completely unnecessary, but it makes shooting things feel more realistic. Hanging objects like lanterns and signs will swing when shot, and the swinging motion is physically accurate based on the object's weight, the force of the bullet impact, and the length of the chain or rope holding it. The game is calculating pendulum physics for hanging objects, creating realistic swinging motions that gradually dampen over time due to air resistance and friction. Here's something useless about ragdoll physics. When someone dies, their body doesn't just play a canned death animation. It becomes a physics object that reacts realistically to forces. But But here's what's pointless. The ragdoll behaviour varies based on the person's body type, clothing, and how they died. A heavy person falls differently than a light person. Someone wearing a heavy coat falls differently than someone in light clothing. Someone shot in the head falls differently than someone shot in the leg. The ragdoll physics also interact with the environment in realistic ways. A body falling downstairs will tumble and bounce realistically. A body falling into water will float or sink based on clothing and body composition. A body on a slope will slide downhill. The game is simulating realistic corpse physics, which is both impressive and deeply unnecessary. Bodies also have different levels of rigidity based on how long they've been dead. A freshly dead body is more flexible than a body that's been dead for hours. The game is simulating rigor mortis, gradually stiffening bodies over time. This affects how the bodies react to being moved or interacted with, creating a level of death simulation that's honestly kind of disturbing in its thoroughness. Let's talk about something truly pointless: the way Arthur's eyes work. His pupils dilate and contract based on lighting conditions. In bright light, his pupils are small. In dim light, they're large. The game is simulating realistic pupil response to light, even though you rarely see Arthur's eyes close enough to notice this detail. Arthur's eyes also track objects of interest. If something catches his attention, his eyes will move to look at it before his head turns. The game is simulating realistic eye movement patterns, where eyes lead and the head follows. This is how real human vision works, but it's such a subtle detail that most players never consciously notice it. Arthur also blinks more frequently in dusty or windy conditions, protecting his eyes from irritation. The game is adjusting blink rate based on environmental conditions, simulating a protective reflex that serves no gameplay purpose, but adds to the realism of the character. Here's something useless about conversations. When Arthur talks to NPCs, his lip sync is not just matching the words, it's matching the emotional tone. Angry dialogue has different mouth shapes than happy dialogue, even for the same words. The game is adjusting facial animations based on emotional context, creating more expressive conversations. NPCs also have micro-expressions that flash across their faces during conversations, brief moments of emotion that appear and disappear quickly, just like in real human communication. The game is simulating realistic facial expressions with subtle variations that operate at the edge of perception, creating characters that feel more alive even if you can't quite articulate why. During conversations, NPCs will occasionally look away, scratch their nose, adjust their clothing, or perform other natural fidget behaviours. The game is giving NPCs realistic idle behaviours during conversations, preventing them from standing perfectly still like robots. These behaviours are randomised and context appropriate, creating natural feeling interactions. Here's a pointless fact about footsteps. Arthur's footsteps sound different based on his weight, his speed, his footwear, and the surface he's walking on. But it goes deeper. The sound also varies based on whether he's walking uphill or downhill, whether he's tired or fresh, and whether he's trying to be stealthy or walking normally. The game has a complex footstep sound system with multiple variables affecting the audio output. Footsteps also leave different marks on different surfaces. Snow shows clear footprints that gradually fill in over time. Mud shows footprints that slowly fade. Dust shows faint impressions. The game is simulating realistic track formation and decay, creating a world where your passage leaves temporary marks. The tracks also vary based on gait. Running leaves different tracks than walking. Sneaking leaves shallower tracks than normal movement. The game is adjusting track depth and spacing based on movement type, creating realistic tracking opportunities that most players will never use. Let's talk about something completely unnecessary: the way plants react to being touched. When Arthur walks through tall grass, the grass bends and sways realistically. When he brushes against bushes, the branches move. The game is simulating plant physics for every piece of vegetation in the world, creating an environment that responds to your presence. But it goes deeper. Different plants have different physical properties. Stiff plants like cacti barely move when touched. Flexible plants like ferns bend dramatically. The game has assigned physical properties to different plant types, ensuring that each species reacts appropriately to interaction. Plants also react to wind, with the amount of movement varying based on the plant's flexibility and the wind's strength. During storms, trees sway dramatically, while small plants whip back and forth. During calm weather, plants barely move. The game is simulating wind effects on vegetation across the entire map, creating a living, breathing environment. Here's something pointless about blood. When someone is shot, blood doesn't just appear. It sprays in a direction determined by the bullet's trajectory and the location of the wound. The blood spray is physically accurate, with droplets following realistic ballistic paths. The game is simulating blood spatter physics, creating gore effects that are disturbingly realistic. Blood also pools differently on different surfaces. On flat ground, it spreads in a circular pool. On slopes, it runs downhill. On porous surfaces like dirt, it soaks in. On non-porous surfaces like stone, it stays on the surface. The game is simulating how blood interacts with different materials, creating realistic blood pooling behaviour. Blood stains persist for a realistic amount of time before fading. Fresh blood is bright red. Old blood is dark brown. The game is simulating blood oxidation, changing the colour of blood over time to reflect its age. This is a level of forensic accuracy that serves no purpose in a game about cowboys. Let's talk about something truly useless: the way smoke from cigarettes behaves. When Arthur smokes, the smoke doesn't just play a canned animation. It's actual simulated smoke that reacts to wind and air currents. If you smoke indoors, the smoke rises straight up. If you smoke outdoors in windy conditions, the smoke gets blown away. The game is simulating cigarette smoke physics for a cosmetic action that serves no gameplay purpose. The smoke also changes based on how deeply Arthur inhales. A deep drag produces more smoke than a shallow puff. The game is tracking inhalation depth and adjusting smoke output accordingly. This is the kind of detail that makes you wonder what the developers were thinking when they decided this level of accuracy was necessary. Arthur's smoking animation also varies based on his stress level. When he's calm, he smokes slowly and deliberately. When he's stressed, he smokes more quickly and takes deeper drags. The game is using smoking behaviour to communicate Arthur's emotional state, creating a subtle character detail that most players probably never consciously notice. Here's something pointless about alcohol. When Arthur drinks, he doesn't just get drunk. He gets progressively more drunk based on how much he drinks and how quickly. The game tracks blood alcohol content and adjusts Arthur's behaviour accordingly. But here's what's useless. Different types of alcohol have different effects. Whiskey gets you drunk faster than beer. The game has assigned alcohol content values to different drinks and calculates intoxication accordingly. The drunk effects also wear off over time at a realistic rate. The game is simulating alcohol metabolism, gradually reducing Arthur's intoxication level based on time passage. This creates a more realistic drinking system, but it's such a minor detail that most players probably just wait for the drunk effects to wear off, without thinking about the metabolic simulation happening in the background. Arthur's tolerance also increases with repeated drinking. If you drink frequently, Arthur will be able to consume more alcohol before getting drunk. The game is simulating tolerance development, tracking Arthur's drinking history and adjusting his alcohol sensitivity accordingly. This is a level of substance abuse simulation that's honestly kind of concerning in its thoroughness. Let's talk about something completely unnecessary: the way Arthur's hat works. If his hat gets knocked off during a fight or a fall, it becomes a physics object that bounces and rolls realistically. But here's what's pointless. The hat's behaviour varies based on the hat type. A heavy leather hat falls differently than a light cloth hat. The game has assigned physical properties to different hat types, ensuring that each hat behaves appropriately when knocked off. If Arthur's hat falls in water, it will float for a while before sinking. If it falls in mud, it will get dirty. If it falls in snow, it will get wet. The game is tracking what happens to Arthur's hat when it's not on his head, maintaining the hat's state even when it's a separate object in the world. Arthur can whistle for his horse to bring his hat back if it falls off nearby. But here's what's useless. The horse will actually pick up the hat in its mouth and carry it to Arthur. The game has a specific animation for horses carrying hats, complete with the hat deforming slightly from being held in the horse's mouth. Someone at Rockstar animated a horse carrying a hat in its mouth, and this animation probably appears in less than 1% of playthroughs. Here's something pointless about camp. The gang members at camp have daily routines that vary based on the time of day, the weather, and what's happening in the story. But here's what's useless. They also have weekly routines. Certain activities happen on certain days of the week. The game is tracking not just daily schedules but weekly schedules for each gang member, creating patterns that unfold over in-game weeks. Gang members also have preferences for who they interact with. Some members are friends and will seek each other out for conversations. Others dislike each other and will avoid interaction. The game has a relationship matrix for all gang members, and it uses this matrix to determine who talks to whom and what they talk about. The conversations at camp also reference recent events, including things you did during missions and things that happened in the world. The game is tracking story events and generating contextual dialogue that references them, creating conversations that feel connected to the broader narrative. Let's talk about something truly useless: the way newspapers work. Newspapers in the game contain actual articles about events in the world, including things you've done. But here's what's pointless. The articles are written in different styles based on the newspaper's political leanings. Some newspapers are more sensationalist, others are more factual. The game has given each newspaper an editorial voice that affects how they report events. Newspapers also contain advertisements, classifieds, and other period-appropriate content that has nothing to do with the main story. The game is filling newspapers with realistic content that most players will never read, creating publications that feel like real newspapers rather than just quest delivery mechanisms. The newspapers also change over time, with new issues containing new articles about recent events. The game is generating dynamic newspaper content throughout the story, creating a sense that the world is reacting to and documenting the events of the game. Here's something pointless about photography. When you take a photo with Arthur's camera, the game doesn't just save a screenshot. It creates an in-game object that represents the photograph. This photograph has properties like exposure, focus, and composition that are evaluated by the game. The game is judging your photography skills and storing that evaluation with the photo. Photos also degrade over time if you look at them repeatedly. The game is simulating photo wear, gradually reducing the quality of photos that are viewed frequently. This is a completely unnecessary detail that simulates how physical photographs degrade with handling. The camera also has realistic limitations based on the technology of the time period. You can't take photos in low light because the exposure time would be too long. You can't take photos of fast-moving subjects because they'll be blurred. The game is simulating 19th century camera limitations, creating a photography system that's historically accurate, even though it makes the camera less useful. Let's talk about something completely unnecessary: the way Arthur's satchel works. The satchel has a weight limit which affects gameplay. But here's what's useless. The weight limit is calculated based on the actual weight of the items you're carrying. A stack of gold bars weighs more than a stack of feathers. The game is tracking the weight of every item in your inventory and calculating the total weight. The satchel also has volume limitations. Some items take up more space than others, regardless of weight. You can carry more small items and large items. The game is simulating both weight and volume constraints, creating an inventory system that's more realistic than most games attempt. Different satchel upgrades increase capacity in different ways. Some increase weight capacity, others increase volume capacity. The game has separate systems for weight and volume, and different upgrades affect different systems. This creates meaningful choices in how you upgrade your carrying capacity, but it's such a complex system that most players probably don't fully understand how it works. Here's a useless fact about fishing. Different fish species have different behaviours that affect how they fight when hooked. Some fish make long runs, others make short bursts. Some jump, others dive deep. The game is simulating species-specific fish behaviour, creating variety in the fishing experience that reflects real-world fish behaviour. Fish also have different feeding patterns based on time of day and weather. Some fish feed more actively in the morning, others in the evening. Some prefer cloudy weather, others prefer sunny weather. The game is simulating realistic fish behaviour patterns, creating a fishing system where knowledge of fish ecology actually helps you catch more fish. The fishing line has realistic physics, with tension that varies based on the fish's movements and your reeling speed. If you reel too hard, the line will break. If you don't maintain tension, the fish will escape. The game is simulating fishing line physics, creating a fishing minigame that's more realistic than most dedicated fishing games. Let's talk about something pointless about trains. Trains run on actual schedules. The same train passes through the same stations at the same times every day. The game has a train schedule system that ensures trains appear consistently, creating a world where you can actually plan around train arrivals if you're patient enough to learn the schedule. Trains also have realistic physics, with momentum that makes them slow to start and slow to stop. A fully loaded train takes longer to stop than an empty train. The game is simulating train physics based on cargo weight, creating realistic train behaviour that affects gameplay when you're trying to rob them. The train cars also have different cargo based on where the train is coming from and where it's going. A train from an industrial area might carry manufactured goods. A train from a farming area might carry agricultural products. The game is generating contextual cargo for trains based on their routes, creating variety in what you find when you rob them. Here's something useless about bridges. They have realistic structural physics. If you blow up a bridge's supports, the bridge will collapse in a physically accurate way. The game is simulating structural failure, calculating how the bridge would realistically collapse based on which supports are destroyed. Bridges also make different sounds when you cross them based on their construction material and your speed. A wooden bridge sounds different than a metal bridge. Crossing at a walk sounds different than crossing at a gallop. The game has contextual bridge sounds that vary based on multiple factors. Some bridges also sway slightly when you cross them, simulating the flexibility of suspended structures. The swaying is subtle but physically accurate, based on the bridge's design and the weight crossing it. The game is simulating bridge dynamics for structures that most players cross without a second thought. Let's talk about something completely pointless: the way doors work. Doors don't just open and close. They swing on hinges with realistic physics. The speed at which you open a door affects how far it swings. If you open a door quickly, it might swing all the way open and bounce off the wall. If you open it slowly, it will stop where you leave it. Doors also have different weights based on their construction. A heavy wooden door is harder to open than a light interior door. The game has assigned weight values to different door types, and these weights affect how the doors move when opened. Doors can also be damaged. If you shoot a door's hinges, it will fall off. If you kick a door hard enough, it might break. The game has destructible doors with realistic failure points, creating interactive environments where doors are actual physical objects rather than just animated barriers. Here's something useless about wind. The game simulates wind as a vector field across the entire map. Wind has direction and strength that vary by location and altitude. Mountain peaks have stronger wind than valleys. The wind direction changes over time, simulating weather patterns moving across the landscape. Wind affects everything in the environment: trees, grass, clothing, hair, smoke, and even bullet trajectories at long range. The game is calculating wind effects on dozens of different systems, creating a world where wind is a real force that affects everything. You can actually see wind moving across fields of grass, creating visible waves as the wind pushes through the vegetation. The game is simulating wind propagation across terrain, creating visual effects that show wind as a moving force rather than a static condition. Let's talk about something truly pointless: the way Arthur's facial hair grows in different patterns. The beard doesn't just get uniformly longer, different areas grow at slightly different rates. The moustache grows slightly faster than the chin. The sideburns grow at their own rate. The game is simulating realistic facial hair growth patterns with regional variation. Arthur's facial hair also has different textures in different areas. The moustache hair is slightly different from the beard hair, which is different from the sideburn hair. The game has multiple hair textures for different facial regions, creating a beard that looks realistic because it's not uniform. If you shave Arthur's beard but leave the moustache, the beard will grow back, but it will go through the same growth stages it went through originally. The game isn't just tracking overall beard length, it's tracking the length of each facial hair region independently, allowing for complex grooming patterns. Here's something pointless about snow. Snow accumulates realistically based on surface angle and exposure. Flat surfaces accumulate more snow than sloped surfaces. Protected areas accumulate more snow than exposed areas. The game is simulating realistic snow accumulation patterns based on geometry and exposure. Snow also melts at different rates based on temperature, sunlight, and surface type. Snow in direct sunlight melts faster than snow in shade. Snow on dark surfaces melts faster than snow on light surfaces. The game is simulating realistic snowmelt patterns based on multiple environmental factors. Footprints in snow gradually fill in as new snow falls or as wind blows snow into the depressions. The game is simulating snow redistribution, gradually erasing tracks over time in a realistic way. This creates a dynamic snow system, where the landscape is constantly changing. Let's talk about something completely unnecessary: the way Arthur's clothes fit. Different clothing items have different fits. Some are tight, others are loose. The fit affects how the clothing moves and deforms when Arthur moves. Tight clothing moves less, loose clothing moves more. The game is simulating cloth physics with different parameters for different clothing items. Clothing also stretches and compresses realistically based on Arthur's movements. When he raises his arm, his sleeve stretches. When he bends over, his shirt compresses. The game is calculating cloth deformation based on body movement, creating clothing that behaves like real fabric. Different fabric types also have different physical properties. Leather is stiffer than cotton, which is stiffer than silk. The game has assigned physical properties to different fabric types, ensuring that each material behaves appropriately. This is a level of cloth simulation that most games don't attempt. Here's a useless fact about saddles. Different saddles have different weights that affect your horse's stamina drain. A heavy saddle makes your horse tire faster. A light saddle allows for longer riding. But here's what's pointless. The saddle weight also affects how the horse moves. A horse with a heavy saddle has slightly different animation timing than a horse with a light saddle. The game is adjusting horse animations based on saddle weight, creating subtle variations that most players will never notice. Saddles also have different levels of comfort that affect how long you can ride before Arthur gets sore. A comfortable saddle allows for longer riding sessions. An uncomfortable saddle causes Arthur to shift and adjust more frequently. The game is simulating rider comfort and using it to drive animation variations. The saddle's condition also affects its performance. A worn saddle provides less benefit than a new saddle. The game is tracking saddle wear and adjusting stats accordingly, creating equipment that degrades over time and needs maintenance. Let's talk about something pointless about lanterns. When you light a lantern, it doesn't just turn on. It goes through a realistic lighting sequence. You can see the flame catch and grow, see the light gradually brighten as the flame stabilizes. The game is simulating realistic lantern ignition, creating a lighting process that takes time rather than being instant. Lanterns also consume fuel over time. The longer you have a lantern lit, the more fuel it uses. Eventually, the lantern will run out of fuel and go dark. The game is tracking fuel consumption for a light source that most players use sparingly because it makes you more visible to enemies. The lantern's light also flickers realistically based on wind conditions and movement. If you're standing still in calm conditions, the light is steady. If you're moving or it's windy, the light flickers and dances. The game is simulating realistic flame behavior for a cosmetic light source. Here's something useless about campfires. When you set up a camp, Arthur doesn't just spawn a fire, he actually builds it. You can watch him gather wood, arrange it, and light it. The game has a full fire building animation sequence that most players skip by using the fast travel option. The fire's size and duration also depend on how much wood you use. A small fire burns out quickly, a large fire lasts longer. The game is simulating realistic fire duration based on fuel amount, creating a camping system where resource management actually matters if you're patient enough to let fires burn naturally. Fires also attract NPCs and animals. Friendly NPCs might approach your camp to warm themselves or chat. Predators might be attracted by the light. The game is using campfires as social and ecological attractors, creating emergent encounters based on your camping behaviour. Let's talk about something completely pointless: the way Arthur's eyes adjust to darkness. When you go from a bright area to a dark area, there's a brief period where you can't see well while Arthur's eyes adjust. When you go from dark to bright, there's a brief period of overexposure. The game is simulating realistic eye adaptation to changing light levels. The adaptation time also varies based on the magnitude of the light change. Going from bright sunlight to a dark cave takes longer to adjust than going from overcast outdoors to a dim interior. The game is calculating adaptation time based on the difference in light levels, creating a vision system that responds realistically to environmental changes. Arthur's night vision also improves the longer he stays in darkness. After spending time in the dark, he can see better than when he first entered. The game is simulating dark adaptation, gradually improving vision over time in low light conditions. Here's something useless about rope. When you lasso someone or something, the rope has realistic physics. It stretches under tension, it coils when slack, it wraps around obstacles. The game is simulating rope physics with realistic material properties, creating a lasso that behaves like real rope. The rope also has a breaking strength. If you try to lasso something too heavy or pull too hard, the rope will break. The game is calculating tension forces and comparing them to the rope's breaking strength, creating a lasso system with realistic limitations. Different rope types also have different properties. A thick rope is stronger but heavier. A thin rope is lighter but weaker. The game has multiple rope types with different characteristics, though most players probably never experiment with different ropes. Let's talk about something truly pointless: the way Arthur's stomach works. When Arthur eats, the food doesn't just restore health, it goes into his stomach, which has a capacity limit. If you eat too much too quickly, Arthur will get full and won't be able to eat more. The game is simulating stomach capacity and satiation. The food also digests over time, gradually emptying Arthur's stomach and allowing him to eat again. Different foods digest at different rates based on their composition. The game is simulating digestion time, creating a food system with realistic timing constraints. Arthur can also overeat and get sick if he consumes too much too quickly. The game will actually make Arthur vomit if you force feed him beyond his capacity. This is a level of biological simulation that's honestly kind of gross in its realism. Here's something pointless about Arthur's voice. His voice changes based on his physical condition. When he's healthy, his voice is strong and clear. When he's injured, his voice is strained and pained. When he's out of breath, his voice is breathy and weak. The game is adjusting voice processing based on Arthur's physical state, creating vocal variations that reflect his condition. Arthur's voice also changes based on his emotional state. When he's angry, his voice is harder and more aggressive. When he's sad, his voice is softer and more subdued. The game is using voice modulation to communicate emotion, creating a character whose voice reflects his inner state. The voice also has realistic acoustic properties based on the environment. Arthur sounds different indoors versus outdoors, different in a canyon versus on a plain. The game is applying environmental audio processing to Arthur's voice, creating realistic acoustic variations based on location. Let's talk about something completely unnecessary. The way bullets work. Bullets don't just deal damage, they have realistic ballistics. They drop over distance due to gravity. They're affected by wind. They lose velocity as they travel. The game is simulating realistic bullet physics for every shot fired. Bullets also penetrate materials based on their caliber and the material's properties. A high caliber bullet will punch through wood that would stop a low caliber bullet. The game is calculating penetration based on projectile energy and material resistance, creating a ballistic system where cover effectiveness varies based on what you're shooting. Bullets that miss their target don't just disappear, they continue travelling until they hit something, or travel beyond their maximum range. The game is tracking every bullet's trajectory through the world, creating a ballistic system where stray shots can have unintended consequences. Here's a useless fact about Arthur's hands. They get dirty when he does dirty work. After skinning an animal, his hands are covered in blood. After working with machinery, they're covered in grease. After digging, they're covered in dirt. The game is tracking what Arthur does and applying appropriate dirt to his hands. The dirt on Arthur's hands also transfers to things he touches. If his hands are bloody and he touches his face gets bloody. If his hands are muddy and he touches his clothes get muddy. The game is simulating dirt transfer between surfaces, creating a contamination system that spreads dirt realistically. Arthur's hands also show wear and damage. If he's been in a lot of fights, his knuckles might be bruised and scraped. If he's been doing manual labour, his hands might show calluses. The game is tracking Arthur's activities and applying appropriate wear to his hands, creating hands that tell a story of what he's been doing. Let's talk about something pointless about ice. Ice on water has realistic physics. It can support weight up to a certain point, then it cracks and breaks. The game is calculating weight distribution on ice and determining when it will fail, creating ice that behaves like real ice. Ice also forms and melts based on temperature. In very cold conditions, water will freeze over time. In warmer conditions, ice will melt. The game is simulating phase changes for water, creating a dynamic environment where ice coverage changes based on weather. The thickness of ice also varies based on how long it's been frozen. Newly frozen ice is thin and breaks easily. Ice that's been frozen for a long time is thick and can support more weight. The game is tracking ice formation time and adjusting thickness accordingly. Here's something useless about Arthur's teeth. They're individually modelled. Arthur has 32 teeth, each one a separate 3D model. The game didn't just texture a mouth interior, it modelled individual teeth. You will almost never see Arthur's teeth clearly enough to appreciate this detail, but they're there, all 32 of them, individually modelled. Arthur's teeth also get dirty over time and can be cleaned by bathing. The game is tracking tooth cleanliness as a separate variable from overall cleanliness. This is a level of hygiene simulation that borders on obsessive. If you look very closely during certain animations, you can see that Arthur's teeth are not perfectly white or perfectly aligned. They have realistic imperfections that reflect the dental care available in 1899. The game gave Arthur period-appropriate teeth, complete with realistic flaws. Let's talk about something completely pointless, the way Arthur's fingers work. Each finger is individually animated and can move independently. When Arthur picks something up, his fingers wrap around it realistically based on the object's size and shape. The game is calculating realistic hand poses for object interaction, creating hand animations that look natural because they're physically accurate. Arthur's fingers also show realistic joint limitations. They can't bend backward. They can't bend beyond realistic angles. The game has implemented anatomically correct finger constraints, ensuring that Arthur's hands always look natural even during complex animations. The fingers also have realistic collision detection. If Arthur's hand passes through a solid object, the fingers will curl or adjust to avoid clipping. The game is actively preventing hand clipping by adjusting finger positions in real time, creating hands that interact believably with the environment. Here's something useless about mud. Mud has different consistencies based on water content and soil type. Some mud is thick and sticky, other mud is thin and runny. The game has multiple mud types with different physical properties, creating variety in how mud behaves. Mud also affects movement differently based on its consistency. Thick mud slows you down more than thin mud. Deep mud can trap your feet, requiring extra effort to pull free. The game is simulating realistic mud physics that affect traversal in ways that vary based on mud properties. Mud also dries over time, gradually becoming dirt. The game is simulating moisture evaporation from mud, creating a dynamic surface that changes state based on environmental conditions. This is a level of terrain simulation that most games don't attempt. Let's talk about something truly pointless: the way Arthur's belt works. The belt doesn't just hold up his pants, it actually has physics. If Arthur moves quickly, the belt and its attachments will sway and bounce realistically. The game is simulating belt physics, creating a clothing accessory that moves naturally with Arthur's body. The belt also has attachment points for various items: holsters, knife sheaths, pouches. Each attachment has its own physics and moves independently. The game is simulating the physics of every item hanging from Arthur's belt, creating a complex system of interconnected physics objects. The belt's tightness also affects how it sits on Arthur's waist. A tight belt sits higher and moves less. A loose belt sits lower and moves more. The game is adjusting belt position and physics based on a tightness parameter that players can't even control. Here's something pointless about Arthur's spurs. They jingle when he walks. The jingling sound varies based on his walking speed and the type of spurs he's wearing. The game has different spur sounds for different spur types, and it adjusts the sound timing based on Arthur's gait. The spurs also have visual physics. They spin when Arthur walks, with the rotation speed matching his leg movement. The game is animating spur rotation based on leg movement, creating a detail that's only visible if you're watching Arthur's feet closely. Different spur types also have different effects on horse behaviour. Some spurs make horses more responsive, others have no effect. The game has assigned gameplay effects to cosmetic items, creating equipment choices that matter beyond just appearance. Let's talk about something completely unnecessary: the way Arthur's shadow works. The shadow isn't just a blob under Arthur, it's a realistic projection of his body that changes shape based on the light source position and the surface it's cast on. The game is calculating realistic shadow projection for Arthur and every other character in the world. The shadow also has realistic softness that varies based on the distance between Arthur and the surface. Shadows close to Arthur are sharp, shadows far from Arthur are soft. The game is simulating realistic shadow penumbra, creating shadows that look right because they follow real-world light physics. Multiple light sources create multiple shadows, each one correctly positioned and oriented based on its light source. The game is calculating shadow projection for every light source affecting Arthur, creating complex shadow patterns in areas with multiple lights. Here's something useless about Arthur's hat shadow. The hat casts a shadow on Arthur's face that moves realistically as the sun moves across the sky. The game is calculating the shadow cast by Arthur's hat on his own face, creating a self-shadowing system that affects Arthur's appearance throughout the day. The hat shadow also affects Arthur's eye behaviour. When his face is in shadow, his pupils dilate slightly. When his face is in direct sunlight, his pupils contract. The game is using the hat shadow to influence pupil dilation, creating a chain of realistic effects from a single piece of clothing. Different hat types cast different shadows based on their brim size and shape. A wide-brimmed hat casts more shadow than a small hat. The game is calculating shadow size based on hat geometry, creating hat shadows that accurately reflect the hat's physical properties. Let's talk about something pointless about rain. Raindrops are individual particles, not just a visual effect. Each raindrop falls with realistic physics, affected by wind and gravity. The game is simulating thousands of individual raindrops, each one following its own trajectory through the world. Raindrops also create ripples when they hit water surfaces. Each raindrop creates its own ripple that expands and fades realistically. The game is simulating water surface disturbance from rain, creating ripple patterns that look realistic because they are physically accurate. Rain also creates puddles that grow over time during storms and shrink over time after storms end. The game is tracking water accumulation and evaporation, creating dynamic puddles that respond to weather conditions. This is a level of environmental simulation that most games don't attempt. Here's something useless about Arthur's ears. They're fully modelled with realistic cartilage structure. The game didn't just texture flat ear shapes, it modelled the complex folds and curves of real human ears. You will almost never see Arthur's ears clearly enough to appreciate this detail, but they're anatomically accurate. Arthur's ears also turn red in cold weather, simulating reduced blood flow to extremities. The game is adjusting ear colour based on temperature, creating a physiological response that's realistic but completely unnecessary. The ears also have realistic acoustic properties. Sounds coming from behind Arthur are slightly muffled compared to sounds coming from in front. The game is simulating how ears affect sound perception based on direction, creating a more realistic audio experience. Let's talk about something completely pointless: the way Arthur's neck works. The neck doesn't just rotate the head, it has realistic muscle and tendon movement. You can see the sternocleidomastoid muscle flex when Arthur turns his head. The game is simulating visible muscle movement in the neck, creating anatomically accurate animations. The neck also has realistic range of motion limitations. Arthur can't turn his head beyond realistic angles. The game has implemented anatomical constraints on neck movement, ensuring that head rotations always look natural. The neck also shows strain when Arthur is carrying heavy objects or exerting himself. The muscles become more prominent, the tendons more visible. The game is adjusting neck musculature based on physical exertion, creating a body that responds visibly to effort. Here's something useless about Arthur's Adam's apple. It moves when he swallows or talks. The game is animating the thyroid cartilage based on throat activity, creating a detail that's only visible during close-up conversations and serves no purpose except anatomical accuracy. The Adam's apple also moves when Arthur breathes heavily after exertion. The game is synchronizing Adam's apple movement with breathing, creating a chain of realistic physiological responses that operate entirely below the threshold of conscious perception. Different voice lines also cause different amounts of Adam's apple movement. Loud talking causes more movement than quiet talking. The game is adjusting Adam's apple animation based on voice volume, creating a detail that maybe 3 people in the world have noticed. Let's talk about something truly pointless: the way Arthur's collarbones work. The clavicles are individually modelled bones that move realistically when Arthur moves his shoulders. The game is simulating skeletal movement for bones that are barely visible through clothing. The collarbones also become more prominent when Arthur is underweight and less prominent when he's overweight. The game is adjusting bone visibility based on body fat percentage, creating a body that changes shape realistically based on nutrition. You can even see the collarbones move when Arthur breathes deeply. The game is animating skeletal movement based on respiration, creating a level of anatomical detail that borders on medical simulation. Here's something pointless about Arthur's wrists. They have realistic joint movement with multiple axes of rotation. The wrist can flex, extend and rotate, and all these movements are animated independently. The game is simulating complex wrist biomechanics for animations that most players never consciously notice. The wrists also show visible tendons when Arthur grips things tightly. The game is adjusting tendon visibility based on grip strength, creating hands that look realistic because they show appropriate anatomical details during exertion. Different grip types also cause different wrist positions. Gripping a gun causes a different wrist angle than gripping a rope. The game is calculating contextually appropriate wrist positions for different activities, creating hand animations that look natural because they're biomechanically accurate. Let's talk about something completely unnecessary: the way Arthur's knuckles work. Each knuckle is individually modelled and animated. When Arthur makes a fist, you can see each knuckle bend at the appropriate angle. The game is simulating realistic finger joint articulation, creating hands that move like real hands. The knuckles also show damage after fights. Bruising and scraping appear on knuckles that have been used for punching. The game is tracking which knuckles have been used for striking and applying appropriate damage textures. The knuckles also crack when Arthur stretches his fingers after keeping them in one position for a long time. The game has idle animations that include knuckle cracking, complete with sound effects. This is a level of character detail that's honestly kind of excessive. Here's something useless about Arthur's elbows: they have realistic skin folding. When Arthur bends his arm, the skin on the inside of his elbow folds realistically. When he straightens his arm, the skin smooths out. The game is simulating skin deformation at joints, creating a body that looks realistic because the skin behaves like real skin. The elbows also show wear from leaning on surfaces. If Arthur frequently leans on his elbows, they might show rougher skin texture. The game is tracking contact points and applying appropriate wear, creating a body that shows the effects of Arthur's habits. Different clothing also affects how the elbows look and move. Tight sleeves restrict elbow movement slightly. Loose sleeves allow full range of motion. The game is simulating how clothing affects joint movement, creating realistic interactions between clothing and body. Let's talk about something pointless about Arthur's knees. They have realistic joint mechanics with multiple ligaments and tendons that affect movement. The game is simulating knee biomechanics, creating leg animations that look natural because they follow real anatomical constraints. The knees also show strain when Arthur is crouching or kneeling for extended periods. The muscles around the knees become more prominent, showing the effort required to maintain the position. The game is adjusting muscle visibility based on joint stress, creating a body that responds visibly to physical demands. Arthur's knees also make sounds when he stands up after crouching for a long time. The game has joint sounds that play during certain movements, creating audio feedback for actions that most games would leave silent. Here's something useless about Arthur's ankles. They have realistic flexibility that affects how his feet contact the ground on uneven terrain. When Arthur steps on a rock, his ankle adjusts to keep his foot flat. The game is calculating ankle articulation based on ground geometry, creating foot placement that looks natural on any surface. The ankles also show strain when Arthur is running or jumping. The tendons become more visible, the muscles more defined. The game is adjusting ankle anatomy based on activity level, creating legs that respond visibly to exertion. Different boots also affect ankle movement. Tall boots provide more ankle support and restrict movement slightly. Short boots allow more flexibility. The game is simulating how footwear affects joint mechanics, creating realistic interactions between clothing and body movement. Let's talk about something completely pointless: the way Arthur's toes work. Yes, his toes are individual and modelled inside his boots, even though you never see them. The game gave Arthur 10 toes, each one a separate model with its own bones and animations. This is the definition of unnecessary detail. The toes also affect how Arthur's boots fit and deform. When Arthur flexes his foot, the boot deforms slightly as the toes push against the leather. The game is simulating toe movement inside boots, creating boot deformation that reflects the hidden anatomy beneath. Arthur's toes also spread slightly when he's barefoot to improve balance. The game is simulating realistic toe behaviour for a state that Arthur is almost never in. Someone at Rockstar programmed toe spreading mechanics for a character who wears boots 99.9% of the time. Here's something useless about Arthur's spine. It's not just a single bone, it's a series of vertebrae that move independently. When Arthur bends, each vertebra rotates slightly, creating a smooth curve. The game is simulating realistic spinal articulation, creating back bending that looks natural because it follows real anatomical mechanics. The spine also compresses slightly when Arthur is carrying heavy loads. The game is simulating spinal compression under weight, adjusting Arthur's height by a few millimeters when he's heavily burdened. This difference is imperceptible but physically accurate. Arthur's posture also changes based on his fatigue level. When he's tired, his spine curves more, his shoulders slump. When he's fresh, his posture is straighter. The game is using spinal curvature to communicate physical state, creating a body language that reflects Arthur's condition. Let's talk about something truly pointless: the way Arthur's ribcage works. The ribs expand and contract with each breath, and you can see this movement through his clothing. The game is animating ribcage expansion based on respiration, creating visible breathing that's anatomically accurate. The ribcage also protects internal organs in the game's damage system. Shots to the ribcage are less lethal than shots to unprotected areas because the ribs provide some protection. The game is simulating skeletal protection, creating a damage system that accounts for anatomy. You can even see individual ribs when Arthur is shirtless and underweight. The game is adjusting rib visibility based on body fat percentage, creating a body that shows appropriate anatomical detail based on nutrition. Here's something pointless about Arthur's shoulder blades. They move realistically when he moves his arms. When Arthur reaches forward, his shoulder blades spread apart. When he pulls back, they come together. The game is simulating scapular movement, creating back animations that are anatomically accurate. The shoulder blades also become more prominent when Arthur is underweight, and less prominent when he's overweight. The game is adjusting bone visibility based on body composition, creating a back that changes appearance based on nutrition. Different clothing also affects how visible the shoulder blade movement is. Tight clothing shows the movement clearly. Loose clothing obscures it. The game is simulating how clothing reveals or conceals anatomical movement, creating realistic clothing interactions. Let's talk about something completely unnecessary: the way Arthur's pelvis works. The pelvis tilts and rotates during walking, creating the characteristic hip sway of human locomotion. The game is simulating realistic pelvic movement, creating walking animations that look natural because they follow real biomechanics. The pelvis also affects how Arthur sits. Different sitting positions require different pelvic angles, and the game calculates appropriate positions for each sitting animation. This creates sitting that looks comfortable and natural because it's anatomically correct. Arthur's gun belt also hangs from his pelvis, and the belt position adjusts based on pelvic tilt. The game is using pelvic position to determine belt position, creating a chain of realistic anatomical relationships that affect how equipment sits on the body. Here's something useless about Arthur's breathing. The breathing rate varies based on activity level, altitude, temperature, and health status. After running, Arthur breathes faster. At high altitude, he breathes harder. In cold weather, his breathing is more visible. The game is simulating realistic respiration with multiple variables affecting breathing behaviour. The breathing also affects Arthur's aim. When he's breathing heavily, his aim sways more. When he holds his breath, his aim steadies. The game is using respiration to affect gameplay, creating a shooting system where breath control matters. You can even hear Arthur's breathing change based on his emotional state. When he's calm, his breathing is slow and steady. When he's stressed, his breathing is faster and shallower. The game is using breathing sounds to communicate emotional state, creating audio cues that reflect Arthur's inner condition. Let's talk about something pointless about Arthur's heart. You can't see it, but the game simulates it anyway. Arthur has a heart rate that varies based on activity level and stress. The game is tracking heart rate even though it's never displayed to the player, and only affects a few subtle systems. The heart rate affects how quickly Arthur's stamina regenerates. A lower heart rate means faster regeneration. A higher heart rate means slower regeneration. The game is using heart rate as an intermediate variable in stamina calculations, creating a more realistic fatigue system. You can even hear Arthur's heartbeat during certain high-stress moments. The game plays heartbeat sounds that match his simulated heart rate, creating audio feedback for a physiological process that's normally invisible. Here's something useless about Arthur's blood pressure. The game simulates it based on activity level and health status. High blood pressure affects how quickly Arthur bleeds from wounds. Low blood pressure affects how quickly he recovers from injuries. The game is simulating cardiovascular function to drive gameplay systems, creating a health system that's more realistic than most games attempt. Blood pressure also affects Arthur's vision. Very high blood pressure can cause temporary vision changes. Very low blood pressure can cause dizziness and fainting. The game is using blood pressure to create physiological effects that impact gameplay in realistic ways. Different activities affect blood pressure differently. Intense combat raises it significantly. Calm activities lower it gradually. The game is tracking activity intensity and adjusting blood pressure accordingly, creating a dynamic physiological system that responds to Arthur's actions. As we drift toward the end of our journey through pointless details, let's reflect on what all this unnecessary complexity means. Red Dead Redemption 2 is a game that simulates things that don't need to be simulated, that models details that don't need to be modelled, that calculates variables that don't need to be calculated. And yet all of these useless details combine to create something remarkable. A world that feels real in ways that are hard to articulate. You might never consciously notice that Arthur's pupils dilate in darkness, or that his hair grows under his hat, or that his knuckles show damage after fights. But your brain notices. Somewhere below the level of conscious thought, your mind is processing all these details and concluding that this world makes sense, that it follows rules, that it's consistent and believable. The useless details aren't useless after all. They're the foundation of immersion, the building blocks of believability. This is what happens when developers are given the time and resources to pursue their vision without compromise. They don't just create the minimum necessary to make the game function. They create systems that simulate reality with obsessive attention to detail. They program horse poop physics and fly AI and individual tooth models because they can, because they want to, because they believe that every detail matters even if players never consciously notice it. The result is a game that feels different from other games, that creates a sense of presence and immersion that's hard to achieve with less detailed simulation. When you play Red Dead Redemption 2, you're not just controlling a character through a game world, you're inhabiting a body in a living, breathing environment that responds to your presence in countless subtle ways. All those useless facts we've explored tonight, the hair growth calculations, the dirt transfer systems, the anatomical simulations, the environmental physics, they all work together to create something greater than the sum of their parts. They create a world that feels real because it behaves like reality, even in ways that don't matter for gameplay. As you drift off to sleep, think about the incredible amount of work that went into creating all these pointless details. Think about the programmers who spent weeks perfecting horse poop physics, the artist who modelled individual teeth, the animators who created knuckle-cracking animations. Think about the passion and dedication required to pursue this level of detail, to care about things that most players will never notice. Red Dead Redemption 2 is a monument to obsessive attention to detail, a testament to what's possible when talented people are given the freedom to pursue excellence without compromise. It's a game that simulates reality with such thoroughness that it creates a new kind of virtual experience, one where the boundary between game and simulation becomes blurred. Let these useless facts fade from your mind now. Let the details blur together into a general sense of appreciation for the craft and artistry that went into creating this remarkable game. Close your eyes and imagine the vast frontier with its countless simulated systems all running simultaneously, creating a world that lives and breathes whether you're watching or not. The hair is growing under Arthur's hat. The horses are pooping with realistic physics. The NPCs are blinking at rates determined by their emotional states. The wind is creating waves across fields of grass. The water is calculating temperature based on depth and location. The mud is slowly drying into dirt. All of these systems are running. All of these details are being simulated, creating a world of staggering complexity and beauty. Rest now, and let the frontier fade into dreams. The useless facts have been shared, the pointless details explored, the unnecessary complexity appreciated. Tomorrow you can return to the game with new awareness of the incredible systems running beneath the surface, or you can simply enjoy the experience without thinking about the details. Either way, the simulation continues, calculating and rendering and simulating, creating a world that feels real because it's built on a foundation of obsessive attention to detail. Good night, and may your dreams be filled with perfectly simulated hair growth, anatomically accurate joint movement, and horse poop with realistic physics. The frontier awaits, with all its useless, wonderful, completely unnecessary details, ready to immerse you in a world that cares about things that don't matter, and in doing so creates something that matters very much indeed. Sleep well, knowing that somewhere in the code of Red Dead Redemption 2, Arthur's hair is still growing under his hat, his pupils are still adjusting to light levels, and his toes are still spreading inside his boots to maintain balance. The simulation never stops, the details never rest, and the world continues to be more complex and realistic than it has any right to be. And that's beautiful, in its own pointless, excessive, wonderfully unnecessary way.